Hey everyone, welcome back to Miniature Painting 101, a series of videos where we teach you all about painting miniatures from start to finish and everything in between. And this is part 119. We're almost in the 120s. Time to talk about gap filling. I recently got a request to do a video on filling gaps with models, specifically metal models, but this applies to resin or plastic models depending on what you want to do anyway. So today I'm going to be trying to assemble a Thunderhead, one of the worst planned out models from Privateer Press. Has tons of gaps in it, so I'll be showing you how several different ways of filling the gaps with this model. And there are a few different materials that you can use. As you can see here, just these two pieces alone have a giant set of gaps between them, including a giant hole, which can be filled with a variety of ways. Now, a few different things you can use to fill gaps is Superglue, or something like Zap-A-Gap. It's a similar product to Superglue. Green stuff, of course, which is my favorite thing to use for it. And finally, some people recommend the liquid form of green stuff, which is just simply called liquid green stuff. I don't personally like to use it because it does shrink significantly, so I'm not going to be showing in this video, but basically you can apply the same technique as the second green stuffing as with liquid green stuff. So the first technique I like to call is pre-filling the gaps. So the first thing you do is you take the miniature and you put the pieces together and see approximately where the holes will be and the gaps will be. As you can see here, I'm just analyzing where the gaps will be between those two pieces. And next I'm going to attach some green stuff, of course, to those areas, and basically I'm going to use them to pre-fill the gaps and then add some super glue as well, so that when you put the miniature together, the gaps are already filled, and that way you end up with a very strong, solid bond, because there's the maximum amount of surface connection between the two pieces, right? So that way when you add the glue in, there's just the maximum amount of surface touching between the two pieces, and it will stick together the best. This is probably one of the things I do the most if I have the option. I like to do this. Next I'll take some super glue and put the two pieces together, like so. Make sure they go in nice and tight and sandwich them together. And then what I like to do is I like to dip either a brush, like one of my glue brushes, or a sculpting tool, in this case just a file, very thin file, in water. The key is when working with green stuff is you want to add water to the tool that you're using, that way it doesn't stick to the green stuff. And I'm just going to push it in slightly and get a nice flush line of green stuff along the connection pieces. But as you can see now, it is completely filled. There's no more holes or gap between the metal pieces, and it looks nice and flush, and when you prime over it, it'll actually blend it in quite nicely. But when it's done, after it's done drying for a while, I like to take either a file, or in this case just a hobby knife, and then quickly trim off the excess, because when you sandwich it together, sometimes you smush a little bit out of the gaps, and then that way you can just use a hobby knife and clean it up. And that way, as I said, it's just nice and flush, and that's the key with green stuff and filling gaps using green stuff. And that's it. So now we have a completely flushed and filled gap. But there's a couple other methods you can use to fill gaps, and I'm going to show both of them. And this second one you can use with liquid green stuff as well. It's the same approach, but I'm just going to use normal green stuff because I prefer it. It doesn't shrink as badly as liquid green stuff. So next, the other option is to glue the pieces already in. But you can see here, I just used some super glue and glued them in. And now I'm just going to take some thin bands of green stuff, put them in to the gaps, and then take, in this case, my basing brush, so the gluey brush, and of course dip it in some water, because again you don't want it to stick to the brush, and then just quickly and gently push it into the gaps. And you can do this as much as you want. Now this method is a little simpler because you can glue the pieces in and then see where the gaps are. It doesn't take any forethought but where the pieces will where there will be gaps between the pieces. But the downside is it does stick out, I find, a little bit more when primed over. It doesn't hide as nicely as the first method, because you basically have to wedge it in, and the wedging can kind of show a little bit. So sometimes it's best to then go after with a file or with a hobby knife again, just to clean it up slightly. But as you can see here, I'm just going to add a little more green stuff into the holes, and then push it once again in with my brush. You can use anything. What I'd probably recommend is just sculpting tool, but in this case this works just as well, so I'm just going to speed it up. So as you can see, I'm just adding a little more at a time and then pushing it into the gaps. Now as I said, this is a pretty simple method, and you can use the same approach with liquid green stuff by just taking it on a brush, a normal brush, and applying it into the gaps. But as I said, with liquid green stuff you get a very significant amount of shrinkage, which then you have to do it repeatedly to get a nice flush filled gap. So I'm just adding it more into the holes and just getting it nice and pushed in and filling it in with this brush. This is the second method that I'll show. And that's it. And then let it dry. And here's a third method with Superglue. And this is actually one that works pretty quickly and well if you don't have any green stuff. So all I'm going to do is take my Superglue and I'm going to put a little bit directly into the gap that I want to fill. And that's it. Now this part does obscure some details, so I don't recommend if there's a lot of details around the connection pieces or the areas of connection which have a gap. So I'm going to take my Superglue, carefully pour it into the gap. Now this is the same method as Zappa Gap, for example, the product line. Now I'm just going to take some water with Superglue. Now I wouldn't recommend this for Zappa Gap, but I'm just going to add a drop of water over the Superglue for a second, and I can take my thumb and make it nice and flush. Essentially I'm doing the same thing that I would do for like caulking around the tub of, if you're caulking around a bathtub, the same kind of approach. Wet your finger and then you can smooth it out and it will fill that gap, and actually quite nicely, and it'll be quite smooth. The only thing is it kind of obscures some of the details, and that's it. So after you see it dries, here are the three methods. On the left side you can clearly see the one where we pre-filled the gap. On the one on the right you can see the one where we post-filled it after gluing them together. And underneath, I'll show you in just a second the result of when we use Superglue. And as you see at the bottom, as you can see, it's really nice and filled on both sides. But as you can see with the Superglue, it is almost invisible. It's actually quite nice. As it obscures a little bit of the details, but it's quite nice and very quick to do as well. I just recommend always dipping your finger beforehand or putting a drop of water.
So thank you as always for watching, and stay tuned for next week's episode, part 120, which is just around the corner. Next Monday as always. But if you want to wait for next week, check out The Warp. Click on the link below for a free 14-day trial to my premium YouTube channel, where not only we get to see like 6 months worth of miniature painting 101 episodes before anyone else, you get to see dozens of painting tutorials, battle reports, face-off episodes, an Airbrush 101 series, Q&J series, just tons of wargaming content. So go and check out The Warp. I think you'll love it. So stay tuned for more videos. Until next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting, everyone.